Hello and welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. There are always so many great questions when I do a live Q&A. So during this time off, I thought I would share some of the questions that have come up from some of our community members that I think a lot of people can probably relate to, and maybe some compilations of some of my other videos. So I hope you find them beneficial, and I will look forward to seeing you very soon. The idea of you cannot heal what you deny is wounded, that actually came from a session quite a long time ago, because I don't really remember the actual session itself. It's actually a conversation I have with people quite often related to the reality of denial and minimization, rationalization around, well, lots of different kinds of experiences that we don't want to acknowledge. And when we do that, if we are not acknowledging the reality of that experience, we can't heal it. We can say that, okay, well, I know that I had this happen, so therefore I need to do these things and that will heal me. Well, that isn't really how healing works. There is an acknowledgement on an intellectual level. There's also an acknowledgement and really a validation that comes at an emotional level, because the wounding happens at an emotional level. So we have to be able to acknowledge it at an emotional level in order to be able to heal it. I'm doing this video today because somebody asked a question in a comment on another video talking about how do you acknowledge something without it kind of feeding into a negative core belief. And I think it's a great question, and I think it can feel kind of not just confusing, but kind of just doesn't really make a lot of sense for a lot of people until you've actually been able to experience how that process works. So there is a very kind of surface level, or maybe first step is a better way to say it, way of no longer denying the wounding. So for example, being able to say, I was sexually abused, or I was sexually abused by this person. That is a step, because if you've only said so far, I was sexually abused, or something bad happened, or something along those kinds of lines, or maybe even actually denying that it happened altogether. But all of those aspects are pieces of denial. And denial serves a really important very important purpose. My goodness, very important purpose during the time that we need to be able to cope with what's happening. So it really is, I think, pretty amazing that we have the ability to be able to be in so much denial. So being able to say what happened, being able to acknowledge circumstances potentially in which it happened, ultimately what you are acknowledging is not just the experience itself, so the act or the one-time thing or the 10-time thing or whatever it is. You're not just acknowledging like, yes, I was abused. You're acknowledging, yes, I was abused, and as a result, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is how it's affected me, any number of those things, and to a degree, all of those things. So you're acknowledging the actual experience, but it does go deeper than that. For example, oftentimes people will say, like, well, yeah, I was abused by, let's say it's somebody that they are relatively close to, so like maybe a cousin or something like that. Yeah, I was abused by a cousin, but it didn't really bother me. We were somewhat similar in age, and I never had to see him again. So that's a form of minimizing and rationalizing. So you're acknowledging that it happened, but you are rationalizing and minimizing the impact that it had on you. So you're in denial about the impact. You're in denial about the fact that just because you don't have a relationship or you didn't have to see that person anymore doesn't mean that it's not still affecting you. So I hope that kind of makes sense. If you have any questions about that, make sure to leave them in the comments. But there are degrees of denial that we can experience. And when we are talking about you can't heal what you deny is wounded, you have to be able to acknowledge kind of the depth and breadth of what that actually means. So I've talked about this a little bit before, but for example, for me, I did a whole lot of healing, and I thought I basically addressed and processed and healed pretty much everything that I needed to heal. And then the last time that I went to therapy, it's been a while ago now, but the last time I went to therapy, it was not at all related to trauma. It was a current situation with a colleague, and it was ultimately related to my childhood, but that's not what the presenting issue was, so to speak. It wasn't bringing up stuff from my past, at least not in a conscious way. What ended up happening is that the situation was very familiar. It brought up an experience that caused me to really doubt my own memory, doubt myself, doubt my ability to be believed by my mother. So it was quite significant. So there was also some betrayal there. So quite significant. Now, I had talked about that situation that created all of that. I processed it. I acknowledged that it was really hurtful. I acknowledged how I rationalized how she responded to me at the time. I worked through a lot of that. What I didn't acknowledge, and it wasn't intentional, and this is important too, that our ability to be in denial is often an automatic thing that we're not even consciously aware that we're doing. So I wasn't aware that I was in denial about this. But it turned out that I hadn't recognized even that in that particular situation, in the way that my mother responded to what I shared with her, that it caused me to completely doubt myself. It did cause me also to feel hurt, which I wasn't really acknowledging. Instead, what I immediately went to at the time was, well, I didn't say it correctly. No wonder she didn't believe me, and all kinds of things to rationalize her response. Now, I did recognize that earlier on and work through a lot of that, but I hadn't recognized the deep impact on my sense of being able to trust myself and my memories that it had had on me. And when I went back to therapy because of this other situation, I ended up really recognizing that. And so then I was no longer in denial about the impact that that had on me. And with that, I was able to move through a lot of that. I was able to heal part of that experience that I didn't really know still needed healing. I didn't know it was still impacting me in that way. So being able to acknowledge the different pieces different pieces of the experience and the different pieces in the way that it's impacted you short term, but definitely long term as well. All of that is really important. And we tend to deny, just based on my experience in working with people and my own experience, we often tend to deny or minimize the impact. And we can do that in a variety of ways, somewhat in a form of denial, oftentimes in terms of rationalizing, but it often is a form of denying the fact that you've been impacted impacted, or the degree to which you've impacted, how it's continuing to show up in your life. For example, one of the things that comes up in so much of my work is people being in denial about the level or even the fact that they feel shame at all. And that was kind of an interesting experience for me when I started seeing that pattern play out. And part of the denial around that, like they might be able to recognize shame maybe in certain things, but oftentimes they're in denial about the shame because to acknowledge the shame, and this isn't conscious, but to acknowledge the shame reinforces the shame. Even when you're doing it in the process of healing, in the beginning, it's often going to reinforce that shame. So it is safer to stay in denial about that shame. So the question that came up, and I apologize that I don't remember exactly all of it, but there was an example that was given, and it was about feeling disappointed and the importance of being able to then acknowledge the disappointment. And it was around like a birthday. And so you acknowledge, I don't remember exactly what it is, so I apologize if you're watching, but the idea I think is similar. Somebody doesn't celebrate or forgets your birthday, and you acknowledge, I feel disappointed, I feel hurt that they didn't acknowledge it. And so in that, you are acknowledging the reality. You're not denying that you're disappointed, that you feel disappointed that they forgot your birthday. And that is really important. In that, what's the most important thing there is not so much about whether they forgot your birthday, why they forgot your birthday, did they really forget your birthday? It's not about any of that specifically. What's most important in that is, I feel really hurt and disappointed. That's really the biggest piece of that. Being able to have self-compassion around that, not talking yourself out of it, not telling yourself, well, maybe they really didn't forget, or maybe they've been really busy and I shouldn't feel this way. I'm making a big deal out of it for nothing. That is denial. So you might say, I feel hurt, but then if you tell yourself you shouldn't feel hurt, you are in then denial about the reality of the hurt. You're in denial about the understanding as to why you might feel hurt. Whether they truly forgot your birthday or not doesn't matter. Whether there's a history of forgetting your birthday or not doesn't matter. Now, it might matter in terms of whether you want to set a boundary around something, but in terms of the acknowledgement itself, it really doesn't matter. So being able to, in that example, say, I feel really hurt, and then being able to be with that sense of feeling hurt without talking yourself out of it, without rationalizing it. So if in that situation, there was a little bit more to the question about reinforcing beliefs. So within that question, how do you acknowledge that without reinforcing the core belief of potentially like maybe that you don't matter or something like that? So I would say that those are kind of not necessarily separate things, but they're two different types of practices that you need to practice over time. It's part of the process. So in that particular example, acknowledging how you feel, not trying to talk yourself out of it, don't beat yourself up about it, don't judge yourself for it. And if your thought process is, they don't care about my birthday, and they don't care about my birthday because I don't matter, or they think I don't matter, and that feels hurtful. But ultimately, like if it's reinforcing an idea that you do not matter, the work that you do on that is going to be around, there's going to be more involved in that. It's going to be looking at patterns and history and looking at the realities of the ways that you do matter, even if you don't have any real examples of these particular people. But that's kind of a whole different sort of thing. Now, if you're seeing a therapist, you can kind of talk about or address both of those things at this kind of at the same time, or at least in the same session. But those are different practices, if that makes sense. So you're acknowledging the disappointment, you're not beating yourself up for it, you're having understanding and grace around it. You're maybe thinking about, particularly if it's a pattern, do I need to set some boundaries around this? That sort of thing. That's an acknowledgement. You are no longer in denial about that. And when you acknowledge the feeling that you're having, you are addressing it, you're witnessing it, you're potentially validating it. And healing happens in those moments, because so much of our coping, the denial, is about pushing it aside so that we don't have to deal with it, so we can go on. But when we push it aside, and I've talked about this many times, when we push it aside, we are telling that little child, or even that young adult child, we are telling that part of ourselves that they shouldn't feel that way, that it doesn't make sense that they feel that way, that they're being overdramatic, that they're being unreasonable, whatever it is. We are invalidating the feelings of that child, that person who has experienced it, the person that you were at the age that you experienced that. Even if it's as an adult, you are invalidating the reality, the lived experience of that situation. You're invalidating the feelings associated with it. You're invalidating potentially even the long-term effects or the immediate aftermath of that experience, but you're invalidating it. So when you can acknowledge it from a place of acceptance, this is how I feel, without telling yourself you shouldn't feel that way, you are then validating that it's okay to feel that way. It's kind of like you're taking that child, we all have an inner child within us, so no matter how old you are, it's like putting your arms around that little boy or girl, picking them up and holding them and saying, I'm sorry you're hurting. Maybe even saying, I wish that wouldn't have happened, or you didn't deserve for that to happen, or you deserve for people to remember your birthday and celebrate you. When you validate it, that is what you are doing. You're not just validating an emotion or an experience. You're wrapping that emotion and that child in a huge hug, in the most cozy, warm, loving, supportive, energizing hug. That's why it's important. Working on it not reinforcing the belief of not being good enough or something like that, that is an incredibly important part of healing as well. But that is a little bit of a different sort of thing. So when you're done watching this, maybe, especially if you've been struggling a little bit lately, give yourself a few moments and just consider, what have you maybe been pushing to the side? What have you maybe not been acknowledging for yourself? Whether it has been something from your past or your current life, but something on an emotional level, maybe a physical level, the video that I shared last week, the importance of being able to take care of yourself, right? Is there something that maybe you are denying, like not feeling well and not taking care of yourself? Are you denying some sort of hurt feelings, or feeling let down, or feeling alone? Whatever it is, acknowledge that and see if you can meet that from a place of compassion, of understanding, instead of trying to berate yourself or talk yourself out of it, telling yourself that you shouldn't feel that way or you shouldn't think that way. This is such an important part of healing. And I truly believe that It is necessary, and the longer we continue to be in denial about various things that have an impact on us, not only does it inhibit our healing, but it further reinforces those false core beliefs. Because every time that you deny or rationalize or minimize, you are invalidating. Every time you invalidate, you are basically like proving, that's your evidence, so to speak, of that false belief. So I'd love to hear from you. What came up? Maybe you noticed even something, especially as I talked about denial in particular and what it means to no longer be in denial. Maybe you notice something coming up in your body, some sort of sensation. Just take a few moments and notice what feels present for you. So avoidance is another one of the coping mechanisms that we tend to use pretty easily and pretty regularly. It's pretty natural for us to do this. One of the challenges with COVID, and there are many, is that because it caused us to kind of stop our lives for a little while, caused us to stay in, to not be surrounded by other people, maybe even not have work for a little while to distract us. It caused people to be with what they feel, their thoughts. And that's not easy for a lot of people. I would say it's not easy for most people who have a lot of difficult emotions within that they've never really allowed themselves to deal with. So avoidance is a very helpful way of coping in a lot of ways. But just like all the other coping mechanisms that I talk about, while it can serve an important purpose for a period of time, it is actually detrimental to our ability to heal and ultimately even to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Because if we continue to rely on the coping mechanisms that we learned automatically as children, then we never really have a reason or the conscious awareness to create healthier ways of being. So avoidance is usually about distraction. Sometimes it can be, no, I don't want to think about that right now. It can also be a way to rationalize or minimize. But avoidance is often, oh, I'll deal with that later, or I don't have time for that right now. It's not a good time. We say all kinds of things to ourselves to avoid dealing with what is present within us. And part of that sometimes is we find ways to distract ourselves. So if there's something that comes up for us, we might find ourselves finding a way to be busy doing something else. And that might be cleaning the house, doing yard work, calling somebody to listen to all of their problems. It could be something that's unhealthy. Drinking, alcohol, drug abuse, sex, relationships even sometimes are ways to distract, to not to feel that thing that's going on inside of us. So again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. But like with COVID, when people didn't have all that external stuff to distract them, to keep their mind occupied with other things, they started noticing, feeling some things that maybe they've not been wanting to feel, maybe not even wanted to acknowledge was at all even close to being present for them. But when we are left on our own without a lot of things to distract us, the things that we typically use as forms of distraction, then naturally, especially in times of uncertainty, which makes us feel more vulnerable, when we feel a little bit more isolated, right? Because we're not able to spend time with people. That vulnerability generally is going to create more opportunity for what's within us to come to the forefront. And there are a lot of people who really found themselves struggling. Yes, part of it is COVID and the fear that that creates, but in reality, it's far more than that for most people. So, what do we do about it? Well, the first thing that I would say is that it can be helpful to check in with yourself periodically and just ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What kinds of thoughts have been floating through my mind today? That actually can be a really helpful and powerful exercise to do on a regular basis. It's one of the reasons that I think journaling is so important, because when you give yourself the space to really check in with yourself, then you're mindful about noticing what is really present. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy, but you can do it. What happens with avoidance is it becomes kind of a natural way of responding and reacting to things. So it becomes almost this habitual thing that we don't even recognize is happening. And the only way that we can change anything that has become habitual is to be very intentional and conscious of making different decisions. So whether it's journaling or just setting a reminder to check in with yourself throughout your day or at the end of your day, beginning of your day, just asking, what am I feeling right now? And maybe you can't name or define what that feeling is, and that's okay. But it's an opportunity to notice what is present. So if a word to describe a feeling or an emotion doesn't come up for you, that's okay. But maybe check in and notice what you feel in your body. So where do I feel something right now? Where do I feel any tension? Where do I feel any pain or unease? Are my shoulders feeling tight? Like maybe really check in with yourself and notice, are your shoulders like this? And if so, then just take a moment and let them relax. And to be very deliberate about that, instead of just saying relax, because our body doesn't necessarily just respond to that, but we can be very intentional about, okay, if my shoulders are up here, and maybe even like this, and sometimes that can happen from working on a computer or writing a lot. So maybe you just very intentionally put your shoulders back and drop them down. And just be there for even 10 seconds. It may actually feel uncomfortable. If you're not used to doing this, if you're used to being like this might actually feel really kind of strenuous in a way. And of course, we don't always walk around like this, right? But the more that we practice that, the less we're going to be like this, as long as we're doing it mindfully. Or maybe you notice tension in your jaw. How many of you really like clench your teeth together? So being mindful of what's happening within you. Maybe you notice that you're actually not sitting straight, like you're kind of leaning over the side or something. If that's the case, then you just very intentionally sit up straighter. Maybe you're slouching just generally. Maybe you take a moment to sit up straighter. If there is a feeling present, meeting that feeling with compassion. And if the timing is appropriate, maybe you just ask, what is this feeling about? And if you don't know what the feeling is, if you can't name it, it's important not to beat yourself up about that. That's okay. I sometimes have difficulty really naming exactly what it is I'm feeling, because so often we're feeling a combination of things. And especially if we don't know exactly what might have created the feeling for us, then it can be harder to really identify. So for me, if I'm feeling kind of stressed, I'll notice maybe a little bit of a constriction in my chest area, or I'll notice that I'm not breathing really fully and deeply. So that might be, for me, what I would notice. And so I would maybe say to myself, okay, I'm not breathing fully. So then in that moment, I breathe, take some very intentional breaths. And then I might ask myself, is there anything that I'm feeling worried about? Because worry is a big thing for me. Is there anything I'm worried about? Is there anything I'm afraid of? Is there anything that I maybe don't want to feel right now? And it doesn't mean in that moment that we have to feel it. It's just about practicing, giving ourselves the space to be with whatever is present. And I think for probably most of you watching this video, asking yourself, what am I afraid of? What am I worried about? And obviously fear and worry are along the same spectrum, but you might not really identify with being afraid of anything. And it's important also to recognize that fear of something doesn't mean that you're necessarily afraid that something bad is going to happen to you. It could be, I'm afraid of disappointing somebody. I'm afraid this isn't going to work out. So it doesn't have to be something really significant or catastrophic. It could be just how we talk to ourselves and what we anticipate that might be coming up. This takes practice to be able to do this. It takes practice to connect with what's present, and it takes practice to allow ourselves to feel into something. And I know for me, if there's something kind of underlying, like underneath the surface, that I'm not necessarily really conscious of, sometimes I will find myself feeling more worried, and that worry will come out as kind of agitation. For some people, it might be a desire to close down and withdraw. For some people, it might be a lot of irritability and angst about something. So if you notice patterns like that, where you tend to have a similar type of feeling that pops up quite often, you can ask yourself, what is underlying that? What's just below the surface of that? And that can help you connect with what those feelings are. So doing that regularly, and journaling is a great way to do that, because when you journal, not only are you identifying what is most present for you or what kind of most at the top of your mind, but as you continue writing, you'll find that you go a little bit deeper, a little bit further beyond what just seems to be very kind of obvious, I guess. And sometimes it is that deeper stuff that helps us really connect with what is present for us, so that we can meet it with compassion, so that upon meeting it, upon that awareness or recognition, we oftentimes just naturally begin to release it. So I know that feeling things, especially if you've experienced trauma and betrayal, tons of grief, the idea of feeling that is the last thing that you want to do. But remember that you felt most of that as a child, when you had no control over your own life, when you didn't have the developmental capacity to really process and understand. So as you allow yourself to feel difficult feelings in your adult life, you do have a different capacity within you, even if it's not yet practiced. You have a different capacity within you now than you did as a child. So while it still may not be easy to feel into the grief, the loss, the sadness, the hurt, the pain, the betrayal, whatever it is that might be there, the fear, it is a different experience now. And hopefully you have support to help you with that. And truly, when we're able to meet that feeling from a place of understanding, the feeling moves through, previously it got stuck a lot because we shut it down in terms of distracting, right? We would shut it down. So all that energy is still there. And then anytime you feel anything similar as in your adult life, it feels really big because that feeling is still there. So when we meet it, it begins to dissipate. So I'd love to hear from you. Can you relate to this? What ways do you use to distract? Humor is one. Withdrawal is another big one. Changing the topic of things. Sometimes, and this is particularly not healthy, I guess I would say, we might project onto somebody else. If we start to feel something that we don't want to feel, we can often project that onto somebody else in a few different ways. So how do you tend to avoid? Are you afraid of what it might mean to start feeling some of those things? This really is one of the reasons why I think it's important to work with somebody who really understands what's going on and has the capacity to be with you as you feel into those things. Have you ever experienced something that has felt pretty difficult at the time, or maybe even a little later, but you've dealt with it by telling yourself something along the line of, it wasn't really that bad, could have been a lot worse. Other people experience things so much worse than that. It's not really that big of a deal. If so, it could be really sabotaging all the work that you're trying to do to heal. So what I was just referring to, those examples that I gave, are ways that we minimize our experiences. One of my most watched videos, or actually I think the most watched video, is on coping mechanisms. And I talked about 4 ways that we tend to cope as survivors of childhood trauma. These are actually relevant to people no matter what their history is, but they play a really significant role for trauma survivors. So today I wanted to talk to you about minimizing in particular. So if you've watched the other video, and there will be a link to that video in the description, but if you've watched that other video, I go into what minimizing is and kind of why it's problematic. But today is all about minimizing, and I want to share with you what it is, but also why it's so important that we don't do it. And what do we do instead? So minimizing is a natural way of coping. And like I said, most of us do it to some extent. But minimizing trauma, minimizing wounding is really detrimental for a few different reasons. But what it looks like are some of the examples that I gave at the introduction. But it's a way of making ourselves feel like what we're trying to deal with is really not that big. It helps us feel a little bit better about whatever that wound is, whatever that fear is. It serves a really important purpose. It truly does. There's nothing wrong with the fact that we minimize. Certainly nothing to be ashamed of. But when we tell ourselves that it wasn't that bad, or we compare our experience to somebody else's and say, well, compared to that, it's nothing, so therefore it really shouldn't bother me that much. And that's where we get into trouble, because when we minimize it, we're doing that to tell ourselves that we shouldn't be that bothered by it. We shouldn't be affected by it. We shouldn't feel upset about it. We shouldn't be sad about it. Which again serves a purpose when we need it, because to feel into all of those feelings was not really available to us as children. But the problem with that is that we are feeling it. Our body is feeling that energy is swirling around. We know that we feel afraid and hurt and all of those things. But we're telling ourselves that we shouldn't because it's really not that big of a deal. Talk about creating problems of self-trust and honoring how we feel and knowing how we feel, which is a whole other issue that I'll cover another time. But that causes us to really believe that we're not affected by something, that whatever it is shouldn't be making us feel bad, that we shouldn't be struggling because of it. And the impact that that has on us is the trust, the self-trust that I mentioned a moment ago. But it makes us feel like there's something really wrong with us, that we're weak, that we just aren't as strong as other people, or therefore deserving as other people. Because if this really isn't a big deal and I'm struggling with it, or it's still affecting me, then what does that say about me? Well, it says you're normal, but in your mind, what you believe that it says about you is that you're weak, that you're damaged, that nobody could ever love you. All of those things and plenty more. And you believe that. That reinforces your underlying core belief of not being worthy, not being good enough. Part of healing requires us to no longer minimize. Because if we're minimizing it, we aren't really able to recognize the significance of what it is we need to heal, or the significance of the impact that it's had on us. I shared in a recent video about my own experience when my husband called 911. And I mentioned in there how I had really told myself that I wasn't affected by it, because I told myself it wasn't that bad. Well, I hadn't heard a lot of stories at that point. I knew that there were far worse things that could happen. And so I shouldn't be affected by that. That had a profound impact on my sense of shame that I carried. Because what was wrong with me? If it wasn't that big of a deal, why was I struggling so much? So part of healing is being able to really acknowledge the fact that it is a big deal. Any wounding that we experience is a big deal. It doesn't have to be a big deal on the spectrum of things that people can experience for it to be a big deal to us. Or even a big deal to somebody who is on the spectrum of really bad things that can happen. Like hundreds of bad things, thousands of bad things. Because anything that creates a wound for you matters. And if we're denying that by minimizing, then we don't ever really have the opportunity to heal the actual wound. We try to put band-aids on things just so that we can seem stronger, more together. And that's not how we heal. So minimizing is making what you've experienced or felt seem insignificant, that it doesn't really matter, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, shouldn't have that much impact. We do it because it allows us to not think anyway that we're feeling all of that stuff. And that happens automatically. We don't make a decision to minimize, at least not in the beginning. So what do we do? What do we ultimately do when we recognize that we're minimizing? Well, the first thing is to recognize that you're minimizing, being able to say, wow, I've always thought that this wasn't a big deal. I've always thought that this didn't affect me. Whatever it is that you've said to yourself. And actually, it did hurt. It did feel painful. It did impact me. Whatever feels relevant for you. So an acknowledgement, right? Because you can't heal what you deny is wounded. So an acknowledgement that that thing that you thought was not really a big deal or shouldn't affect you as much as it does, it is a big deal. And it's natural that you're affected by it, especially for anybody listening who has experienced trauma. Anybody who is listening who has experienced childhood uncertainty, poverty, dysfunction, mental illness of your caretakers, a lack of safety in your environment, feeling hungry. All of that is about uncertainty. So anything that created any of that for you is a big deal. It's a big deal because it has had an impact on how you view yourself, how you feel about your life, and what is available to you. So, acknowledgement is first, and then the reality is that much of the time, when we acknowledge that truth, it can feel painful. It can feel even a bit overwhelming depending on what it is we're acknowledging. But as I've said in other videos, you've already lived through that. So it's not that you have to live through it again. It's just an acknowledgement that it makes sense that you feel some of the things that you feel, that you struggle in some of the ways that you struggle, that even when you've read the books and done the things, that it hasn't actually changed a whole lot because you haven't been able to heal the actual thing that caused the wound. Because you've minimized it and thought it wasn't a big deal. But in acknowledging it, in allowing yourself to look at and connect the dots of the impact that it's had, there's healing that happens in that. And then you're able to really understand and heal that experience or those experiences. And I want to be clear that minimizing has a place, especially when you have no alternatives, when you don't have any ability to control anything that's going on in your life. It serves an important purpose. Even in our adult lives, there are times that minimizing can play a role. Now, it doesn't help us in the long run because the whole idea of denying the reality when we can't heal it, but there's no shame in it. There's nothing to feel bad about. But to live our lives from a place of openness and freedom, we have to be able to acknowledge the reality that some of those things that you've been telling yourself your whole life are not a big deal, they actually are. The things that you've been telling yourself that really shouldn't bother you, either then or now, well, there's a really good chance that it makes complete sense that it did and it does. And there's self-compassion in that. And self-compassion is necessary for healing as well. So being intentional about how you speak to yourself about different experiences. So check in with yourself, whether it's about past stuff or current stuff that's going on in your life. Do you tend to minimize? Have you used it as a way of kind of separating yourself from the reality of a different experiences? Is it one of the ways that you compare to other people? Share in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever found yourself saying something along the lines of, well, she was really stressed out. He didn't know what he was saying. He had a really long day. Things have been really stressful lately. If so, today's video is for you. These examples that I gave are examples of rationalizing. It's something that really most of us tend to do on some level at certain times. For survivors of childhood trauma, It's one of the ways that we cope. It's a really important way that we cope. And so today I want to talk a little bit about that, why we do it, what it is, and how to kind of not use it anymore. Because the truth is that you can't really heal if you continue to rationalize. So, rationalization is basically making an excuse for somebody's behavior, or even our own, depending on what it is. But rationalizing somebody else's behavior to basically excuse what they've done or what they've said. And like the idea of, well, he was really stressed out. He was, or she was really not aware of something. We do that as a way to make it feel less hurtful about what that person has done. So if you think about abuse, if you were to acknowledge that somebody that you trust and care about chose to abuse you, that would be incredibly overwhelming on an emotional level, on a psychological level. It would be quite likely literally too much to take in, especially if that is somebody that you have ongoing contact with, somebody that you have to rely on. We can't allow ourselves to accept that somebody is dangerous, that somebody is making choices that are hurtful, that we don't actually feel safe. That would be incredibly overwhelming to our nervous system, and we wouldn't be able to continue to go on. So we rationalize, as well as other coping mechanisms. But when we basically excuse the person's behavior, then it doesn't feel as overwhelming. It doesn't feel as personal. But the problem with that is that if it isn't them, if there is an excuse for it, then nothing bad really happened, which goes kind of to my previous video about minimizing. Well, if he did it because he was just really stressed out, then it's not really because I'm bad. But in reality, you do believe that you're bad. In reality, you are taking responsibility for what's happened, which makes you believe that you're bad. If you are somehow at fault, then what does that say about you? Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't actually say anything about you, and it is absolutely not your fault. But our mind is incredibly powerful. And the way that we cope is literally about survival. So while it doesn't feel good to feel that we're at fault, to believe that we're at fault, it is easier to cope with that than the alternative, that somebody makes a choice to hurt you. One of the things that I've heard so often from clients, and myself included, is that their abuser was drunk or high. I said that a lot to myself. I said it to other people as I was on my own healing journey. Well, it only happened when he was drunk. So therefore, he didn't really mean it. Therefore, it's not really that bad. And in that situation, it actually wasn't completely true that it only happened when he was drunk. I just needed to believe that it only happened when he was drunk, because then it made more sense. Then maybe it really wasn't that he was choosing. And coming to terms with somebody choosing, because that's what it is. It doesn't matter if they're under the influence. It doesn't matter if their mental capacity makes it so that they don't really understand what they're doing. It's still a choice. And when we continue to believe that it is not a choice, that there is an excuse for the choices that they're making, for the behavior that they're engaging in, then it seems like there's nothing really bad about it. It makes it more likely that we will feel guilty about not forgiving or not wanting to be around that person. I've known so many people over the years who really struggle with guilt and shame because they've made excuses for the abuser and yet don't want to be around them. And that's a really hard thing to navigate too, because if you really believe that it's really not that big of a deal, that it wasn't meant to be what it was, then how do you heal that? Because you're not really able to get at the truth of part of what you're healing, and that is the significant amount of betrayal and hurt that you feel and have experienced. That betrayal is a reality. It's not just something that you feel, though everything that you feel matters. The truth is that that person betrayed you, even if it was a stranger. We have a right, children especially have a right to feel safe in the world. And whether it's a stranger or somebody that you have to rely on who made the choice, you no longer feel safe. So, moving out of rationalization is challenging much of the time. And the closer the nature of the relationship with your abuser, typically the more challenging it is, because there are so many layers to the impact, to the betrayal, and therefore to the healing. We do this in other ways beyond abuse. We do it to make excuses for a boss that wants us to put in a lot more hours, for a friend that you've told, that maybe you weren't available for something and they try to guilt you into it. Maybe you make an excuse for that. We do it a lot. We do it in all kinds of ways. Because when we rationalize it, it creates something within us that suggests that we need to tolerate it, that we need to accept it, that our feelings about it are invalid because this person didn't really mean it. They didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't understand the impact. But your feelings about it matter. Whether that person intended it or not, the impact that it has on you matters.